Hello, BookTube. It's Saturday morning. It's a very sunny Saturday morning, although it's 25th November, so when I record this, you're going to see it. Well, who knows when you're going to see it? A lot is going to depend on when I finish the book you can see on the table. You might be expecting me to say, welcome to another NonFiction review, because that's how I labeled the video. Let me explain why that's true, but also not true. When I decided to take on the Read What You Own challenge, I realized that many of the books that I've neglected to read, and particularly the nonfiction, they were longer books. And particularly when you start a BookTube channel, I think what can happen is you can shy away from seriously bulky books because you're trying to think, well, how am I going to have that read so that I can make content? So I was unconsciously going for quick wins. And sometimes you have to, of course, but the downside is that, really good reading material waits. This book is one of these. I'm just going to bring it closer. So this is what I'm reading in nonfiction right now. Orlando Figes' Natasha's Dance, A Cultural History of Russia. Orlando Figes, he specializes in all aspects of Russian history. And his writing, from what I have read, I like his writing because it achieves that balance between laying out a lot of fact, but also having prose that's structured in a way that it's friendly to the non-academic reader, and that doesn't always happen. So given that this was a longer book, it's 586 pages, I began thinking, is a review really the best way to present the material, or should I give you a more in-depth experience? So I'm going to try the latter. What my plan is I'm going to accumulate short video clips. They won't always look like this one. Saturday morning, I have been rushing around getting the person who watches television, getting him to the library with all the baked goods I made. You probably saw that on my post, but I had to help him take those over. So I really didn't get ready for being great on camera, and I just thought, hey guys, let's get the video started. I can always, give you some FaceTime later on. So what I'm going to do is accumulate these short video clips. The book has 8 chapters, and they're long. So I decided, why don't I cut a little clip when I finish each chapter? Just talk about the significant points. So this clip is going to concentrate on the paratextual material that comes before the first chapter. And I've marked my place. I marked my place with my phone. Let's just move that away. Excuse me, phone. There we go. So yeah, there is a list of illustrations and photographs because there are 66 illustrations. They head the chapters, they're inserted into the text, and there's also, I think you can probably tell, there are 2 sections of color plates on glossy paper, and that befits a book on culture. Maybe I'll give you a look at one of them because there's such beautiful paintings on here, but this one, oh, come here. This one caught my eye. I don't know this artist, Nathan Altman, portrait of Anna Akhmatova, painted in 1914. But you can see that it's worth having the color plates there as well for the detail. That camera doesn't focus very well close up, does it? Be better off having my mobile phone camera. That's a shame. That's not really showing you the details it is. But there we go. So that's the illustrations. But then what follows the illustrations are maps. And oh, I love maps. And I'm just going to show you a couple because they're quite impressive. The first one that I really, really, really liked was this one. It's spread over 2 pages, and it is a map. Oh, this book is hard to pick up with one hand. A map of St. Petersburg, obviously from the amount of cathedrals, theaters, palaces, and galleries. It's a place where culture happens, so it's going to be important. The other map, I mean, there's loads, but the other map that really caught my eye, if I see if I can find that one, is this one, which I guess is going to be important to the first chapter because it's called European Russia, which is the first chapter. Yeah, it really doesn't focus very well, does it? It's not meant to be a close-up camera, so I'm sorry, everybody. You're not going to really be able to read that text, so I'll have to. Sorry about that. I thought this little handheld would do a better job at focusing, but it's not so good. Okay, I should have taken a mobile photograph of the map, but what it shows is Well, obviously everything to the west of the Ural Mountains. But in addition, it shows estates. Now, I always knew that Tolstoy had an estate, and it is due south of Moscow. But also Stravinsky and Rachmaninoff and Pushkin, they also had estates, which is interesting. And I can see two artistic colonies on this map. Now, I have no idea what those are. And then, of course, after the maps, there's some explanation about measurements and languages used, and then it goes into the introduction. And I think the introduction is kind of cool. Since it's no point me showing you the text because you won't be able to you won't be able to see it. I'll read you a passage, and you can just enjoy looking at my books and the Yellow Yeti there while I give you a taste of this book. In Tolstoy's War and Peace, there is a famous and rather lovely scene where Natasha Rostov and her brother Nikolai are invited by their uncle, as Natasha calls him, to his simple wooden cabin at the end of a day's hunting in the woods. There, the noble-hearted and eccentric uncle lives, a retired army officer, with his housekeeper, Anisya, a stout and handsome serf from his estate who, as it becomes clear from the old man's tender glances, is his unofficial wife. Anisya brings in a tray loaded with homemade Russian specialities, pickled mushrooms, rye cakes made with buttermilk, preserves with honey, sparkling mead, herb brandy, and different kinds of vodka. After they have eaten, the strains of the balalaika become audible from the hunting servant's room. It is not the sort of music that a countess should have liked, a simple country ballad, but seeing how his niece is moved by it, Uncle calls for his guitar, blows the dust off it, and with a wink at Anisya, he begins to play with the precise and accelerating rhythm of a Russian dance, a well-known love song, Come a Maiden Down the Street. Though Natasha has never before heard the folk song, it stirs some unknown feeling in her heart. Uncle sings as the peasants do, with the conviction that the meaning of the song lies in the words and that the tune, which exists only to emphasize the words, comes of itself. It seems to Natasha that this direct way of singing gives the air the simple charm of birdsong. Uncle calls on her to join in the folk dance. Now then, niece, he exclaimed, waving to Natasha the hand that had just struck a chord. Natasha threw off the shawl from her shoulders, ran forward to face... it's not easy turning the page with one hand either, bear with me. Ran forward to face Uncle, and setting her arms akimbo, also made a motion with her shoulders and struck an attitude. Where, how, and when this young countess, educated by an émigré French governess, imbibed from the Russian air she breathed that spirit, and obtained that manner which the Pas de Châle would, one have supposed, long ago have effaced. But the spirit and the movements were those inimitable and unteachable Russian ones that Uncle had expected of her. As soon as she had struck her pose and smiled triumphantly, proudly, and with sly merriment, the fear that had at first seized Nikolai and the others that she might not do the right thing was at an end, and they were all already admiring her. She did the right thing with such precision, such complete precision. And the introduction goes on to say, what enabled Natasha to pick up so instinctively the rhythms of the dance? How could she step so easily into this village culture from which, by social class and education, she was so far removed? Are we to suppose, as Tolstoy asks us in this romantic scene, that a nation such as Russia may be held together by the unseen threads of a native sensibility? The question takes us to the center of this book. And so, the book is going to examine how Russia, which sits between Europe and Asia, how it uses culture to define itself, which means it has to examine the conflicting cultural pulls from Europe and Asia, but also the conflict between the European educated and oriented upper classes and the Russian working people who are tied to the land directly under their feet. That's a first taster. That's my first clip done. I'm going to come back later and talk to you about the first chapter when I finished reading it. Hi everybody, I am back. I finished chapter 1, which is called European Russia, and it covers the period from 1703 to 1812. 1703 was the date that St. Petersburg was founded as a city. That Figes covers in detail. It's an astounding work of land reclamation, and it must have cost I don't know how much in terms of money and time and lives. It's interesting, the contrast that this chapter shows up between Western European culture and Russian culture at the time. In Western Europe, as we all know, the countries were expanding beyond their borders, weren't they? Exploring overseas, taking new territories on land and transforming those landscapes. Whereas in Russia, interestingly, it seemed to be more of a time of expansion within their own borders, transforming the landscape of Russia, because that's what St. Petersburg literally was, a transformation of a piece of landscape from something that was completely uninhabitable to the city that we now know. And it just seemed as though Peter the Great and the Russian governments of the 18th century were using St. Petersburg as almost a signal that it was time to erase Russian medievalism. But medievalism in Russia was different than what we know from Western Europe. We know that in Western Europe, nobility were independent landowners. Even if they got their land from the monarch, it was their land. And it meant that as long as they owned their own land, they had a platform for personal power. And if they combined that with other nobles, then they could use that combined power to influence the monarch and his decisions. Now, that wasn't so in Russia. In Russia, all the land always belonged to the Tsar. His nobles had it on loan. It wasn't really ownership. And as the book says on page 14, the slightest disloyalty to the Tsar could lead to a noble having the complete loss of his estates. So 18th century Russia, according to Figes, it was driven by this Europhilia that was spearheaded by Peter the Great, and imported Western European architecture, dress, manners, cultural forms. They all came in to Russia. Russia seemed to feel this pressure to catch up. Now, the bulk of Russians, of course, the hundreds and thousands of serfs, they didn't probably feel much difference, but it was the upper classes who'd previously lived in simpler homes, previously lived a little closer to the land. There was this incredible transformation in their behavior, even the language that they spoke. But with all that transformation, there was also this underlying tension. Fear that somehow they were separating from a simpler and more spiritually attuned life, separating themselves from their own Russianness, if that makes sense. I'm going to read a passage from page 52 because I think it's interesting. Nyaznin's satire was one of several to equate the foreign pretensions of Petersburg with the moral ruin of society. The Petersburg dandy, with his fashionable clothes, his ostentatious manners, and effeminate French speech, had become an anti-model of the Russian man. He was the butt of comedies. These comedies contained the ingredients of a national consciousness based on the antithesis of foreign and native. The decadent and artificial manners of the fop were contrasted with the simple, natural virtues of the peasantry, the material seductions of the European city with the spiritual values of the Russian countryside. Not only did the dandy speak a foreign language to his Russian elders, he also lived by a foreign moral code that threatened Russia's patriarchal traditions. Very interesting, that. Orlando Figes quotes Dostoevsky as saying, "We Russians have two fatherlands, Russia and Europe." In the early 19th century, it wasn't unusual for members of the Russian aristocracy to speak only French. Literally to have trouble speaking Russian fluently. That is amazing. Is there any other European country where it could be said that the wealthier inhabitants were not uniformly fluent in their own language? So instead of developing a culture in their own language in the late 18th century, early 19th century, it seemed like the Russians were rejecting themselves. There was no full Russian translation of the Bible before 1870. But all the strenuous importation and imitation of Western, particularly French culture, you just knew a backlash was coming, because that was creating an unhealthy self-hatred. So that's my look at chapter 1. And we'll follow on, of course, with chapter 2, which starts with that all-important year of 1812. Okay, so we're back. We've read chapter 2, Children of 1812. Really timely, considering Ridley Scott's film is in the cinemas. Napoleon's invasion of Russia. disrupted the social order, as you can imagine. Now, Figes talks about this. He talks about the two ways it disrupted. The first, it made Russians question their whole social hierarchy. War took noblemen away from their country homes and all their social obligations, which kept them busy, and it took them into the open country where they were with serf armies. Serfs had no citizenship, they had no land of their own at that time, and they weren't always considered quite as human as their betters. So naturally, a war where you're fighting alongside these men, you're seeing their courage, their determination, their persistence, their sacrifice, all on behalf of the country. What can you conclude except that they deserve something better? And so Figes focuses this chapter on the Decembrists, which is there were many groups of Russian aristocrats who were affected by the relationships they built with the peasants during the war, and they started to seek ways to reform Russian society. Now, one of the big names there were many big names. One of them was Sergei Volkonsky. He was a member of an old Russian noble family and perhaps the closest family to the Romanov Tsars. Volkonsky was also a distant cousin of Tolstoy because his mother was a Volkonsky. Sergei Volkonsky, he expressed a desire to visit the United States. This shows where his mind was. He called it, quote, a country that had captured the imagination of all Russian youth because of its independence and democracy. So you have the 1812, Napoleon invades Russia. 1815, of course, the war is over, the country is recovering, and there are a number of aristocrats, former officers, who they're organizing meetings now because they want to discuss how can we change the way we govern ourselves, how can we give a better quality of life to the serfs, how can we give them citizenship, educate them, give them land so that they can have economic independence. Before Napoleon's invasion, there was a hope that the Tsar Alexander would agree to reforms because he was already reforming. He had asked his advisor to draw up plans for a constitution. And that was all riding the wave of that Europhilia that I talked about from chapter 1. So it was all inspired by the civil and legal changes that were being made in post-revolutionary France. But of course, the war blew that away. Suddenly, everything reform became equated with being French and therefore unacceptable. The Tsar appointed a new advisor who was very conservative. But of course, the dissatisfaction remained and the need for reform remained. And that caused radically minded nobles like Volkonsky to form. He became a member of just one of the many groups that were getting together to secretly plan how could they force change. Then in 1825, Tsar Alexander suddenly died. And it looked like that might be a window of opportunity. But intelligence about the Decembrist plots, they did get through to Tsar Nicholas I. And the associates, the various groups, were not as organized and unified as they needed to be. Decembrist-led serf troops marched to St. Petersburg in 1826, but didn't get anywhere. The soldiers were easily persuaded by the Tsar to change sides. So Volkonsky, as a result, was arrested, exiled to Siberia, did not return until he was a very, very old man. The other change, of course, we talked about this need for social change, this desire for social change. There was a desire for cultural change in Russian writing, music, visual art. That Europhilia was taken over by this strong attempt to find something uniquely Russian and bring it to those art forms. I was interested to learn that Pushkin was considered to have Decembrist sympathies. That will make me go look now. I've not read his writing, but it really helps to know the context. And when Tolstoy began working on War and Peace, apparently, his Bolkonsky family was based on the real-life Volkonskys. And according to Figes, Tolstoy was actually intending originally to write a book about the Decembrist movements that failed. I could say so much more, but I might as well just read this book aloud on camera then. I'm really enjoying this slow read of Natasha's Dance. So what I think I'm going to do, though, because it is a slow read, is take these 3 clips and treat them like a review part 1, and then get them up on YouTube so you get a taster for this book. And then I need to make a pragmatic shift from reading paper books to reading ebooks, and that's from about now until about the middle of January. So if you don't mind, please expect a follow-up video, sure, to this one where we go through the remaining chapters of Natasha's Dance. But that will come sort of later in January, if that's okay. All right. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Happy reading. Bye-bye.